It had been a long, intense day. I had been called at like 5 a.m., and it was probably close to 10 p.m. when they finally turned the cameras around on me. And I got to the last little bit. I couldn't say the lines. I kept losing the lines. And so the crew was all ready to go home. I was exhausted. They were all exhausted. And here was the guest star, unable to say her lines. Hi, I'm Deborah Strang, and you might remember me as Admiral T'Lara on Deep Space Nine. And this is Trek Untold.
Welcome to Trek Untold, the Star Trek podcast that goes beyond the stars. I am your host, Matthew Kaplowitz. On today's show, we're going to get a little bit theatrical as we speak with a performer who's played a wide range of characters, but unless you're a supporter of the arts on stage, you might not have seen as much of her as you should have. Deborah Strang played Admiral T'Lara on the Star Trek Deep Space Nine episode Rules of Engagement, which is one of my favorites from season 4 of that series. It also featured another guest who appeared on this podcast, Mr. Ron Canada, and was brilliantly directed by LeVar Burton. In addition to her time on Trek, Deborah has appeared in LA Law, Night Court, The X-Files, Quantum Leap, ER, Days of Our Lives, NCIS, Carnival, Grey's Anatomy, and many, many more. And her career is also filled with some notable Star Trek connections. We're going to dive into a few of those today, of course, but you also might recognize her voice as Aunt May from the Spectacular Spider-Man cartoon and Granny Goodness from Young Justice. So yeah, we're talking to somebody who's in both Marvel and DC's world. While she's done some great work in TV and film, much of Deborah's career has been in the theater. Today, Deborah is very active as a resident artist at a space in California called A Noise Within. And while we were recording this interview, Deborah was in rehearsals for a show at this very theater, a play by George Bernard Shaw titled Miss Alliance. It opens on May 12th and runs through June 9th at A Noise Within in Pasadena, California. So if you're in the area on those dates, I urge you to go get a ticket from www.anoisewithin.org and see this very atypical Shaw play and watch Deborah and her talented co-stars performing live. So let's bring the curtain up and spend some time getting to know the one and only Deborah Strang. But before we start our chat with this week's guest, I want to remind you to please follow Trek Untold on social media, including Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. You can find this show on all of those platforms simply by searching for Trek Untold. Make sure you subscribe to this show, whether that's on the audio platform of your choosing or on YouTube, where the video version of this show lives. And speaking of, make sure to check out our YouTube channel more frequently for episodes of our new mini show, Tales from Trek Untold, as well as other sci-fi goodies. And of course, don't forget to leave ratings, reviews, comments, and whatever you can do no matter what platform you're on to enjoy this podcast and show others that you're digging it too. If you want to support this show financially, please consider becoming a Patreon member at patreon.com/trekuntold. Shout out to Trek Long Island, who is having their second annual convention this summer at Hop Hog, Long Island, New York, from May 31st to June 2nd. Headlined by Melissa Navia from Strange New Worlds, Armin Shimmerman, Chase Masterson, and J.G. Hertzler from DS9, Ethan Phillips from Star Trek Voyager, and Gabrielle Ruiz from Lower Decks. Among many other modern and classic Trek shows, this 3-day event will feature autographs, panels, including some with yours truly, and other ways for you to hang out with the stars and meet your fellow fans. You can learn more about this event or buy tickets for it at treklongisland.com. Now, without further ado, let's go ahead and beam in this week's guest. Computer, access interview file. When today's guest isn't being logical, she's being theatrical. Deborah Strang, welcome to Trek Untold.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
I hope you enjoyed that nice little short intro, but don't worry, I've said many, many good things about you before our interview actually started, because there's a lot to talk about here. You've got an amazing career on stage and on screen, and I'm excited to really dig into that stuff today.
let's give it a go.
All right, let's go for it. Well, Deborah, I'd like to kick things off by asking you the question I like to start all my interviews with here. And that's, were you a fan of Star Trek as a kid? Do you have an earliest memory of Star Trek at all?
I do not. I do not. I was about 16 years old when the show started. And I remember seeing some episodes, but I wasn't a big TV watcher at the time to begin with. So it was not something I tried to tune into. I was usually out of the house doing something else.
All right, well, let's figure out what it was that you were doing, because I want to dig into a little bit of your background, if you don't mind, Deborah. So I'd love to hear if you can tell us where you grew up, who your parents were and what they did, and what did little Deborah want to be when she grew up?
Well, I grew up in a very small town in the southwestern corner of Virginia in the Appalachian Mountains. The
Very
town
far from Hollywood.
Yeah, it was Big Stone Gap was the name of the town. People ask me sometimes what was the population. I have no idea. I Google it every now and then, but I just don't remember. My high school class had about 100 people in it. So if that's any indication of how large it was. And my father was a coal miner. He was a mining engineer, and he was more in the administrative side of coal mining, but he loved the mines, and he visited the mines every single day and went down into the mines. My mother was a housewife, and I was one of 5 children. I was right in the middle. And my brother and sisters would probably say that I was always very theatrical, always telling stories, always performing. But the idea of actually being a professional actor was not something that was feasible. It was a dream, but not anything that one seriously would undertake at the time.
So in a high school of like 100 people, I mean, is there a theater program? Are you doing plays and that kind of thing?
And there was not a theater program. There was every year a forensic play or something that we would do, a competition in the state. And I certainly was involved in that, probably my junior and senior year. And there was a school play that the seniors did every year. I was involved in that. But there was also a community theater that I was involved in from a pretty early age. And the community theater eventually developed an outdoor theater that did a performance, a play, the same play every year. It's actually been running for probably close to 60 years now. So I was involved in that for every summer from age 13 through probably my junior year in college.
So it doesn't really sound like you were surrounded by an environment that's conducive to the arts, though. So, I mean, where did you get that kind of spark to keep you going and to pursue this beyond these little community theater productions?
It just sort of snuck up on me. I went to a small college, liberal arts college called Emory and Henry College. That was a couple of hours away from my home. It felt much further at the time because you used to have to go over a mountain and around to get there. Now there are larger highways that can get you there pretty quickly. But they had a small theater department there, and my professor was very encouraging and inspiring, and I did the plays there. So by the time I graduated from undergraduate college, I was pursuing theater. But my intention at the time going to college was I was going to follow John Kennedy's decree to, what are you going to do for your country? I was going to be a social worker.
And somehow along the way, the plans kind of changed and you ended up full time into the acting world. So, I'd like to know, again, you're coming from this kind of like very small part near, the Appalachian Mountains. And, now you're suddenly performing on stages full of many, many people. I would imagine it's kind of like a bit of a shock, right? Was that something that took you time to get used to?
Well, yes and no. It took me a long time to get better at it, probably, because I didn't really go the route of training to be an actor that many actors take. So it was a long journey of trying to learn the craft, not just being an emotional kid trying to tell a story, uh, but being a crafted actor. So I went on to graduate school at the University of North Carolina. I studied with various teachers along the way, vocal training and this, that, and the other. So it took a while for it to be something that I can be proud of. My many years of pursuing.
So I know at some point in the story here, you found your way over to New York and that theatrical scene, right? So can you tell us how that happened?
Oh, once again, I sort of slip into things. After graduate school, I actually moved to Boston, uh, just because I had friends who lived there. So I got my equity card while I was in Boston, and I was already almost 30 years old by the time I moved to New York. Is that true? Yeah. And so I loved living in New York. I thought I'd live there forever. Most of the theater you do in New York is out of town, so that you're always auditioning for regional theater, which was great too, because you'd get a job, you'd go out of town. All you had to focus on was the play you were doing and the people you were doing it with. Today we've got our phones, we've got our computers. So when you go out of town to do a job, you're still linked in, you're still taping auditions for other things. But back in the 70s and the 80s, you didn't have those things. So you were really focused on the work and the play. And it was every summer going to do summer stock in New Hampshire, going up to Massachusetts to do a job, to Cincinnati. It was great. I would always take my cat, and it was a great life. And then when you were in town, it was waiting tables. It was a group of friends that I'd gone to grad school with had all joined together, and we had developed a reading group that we would meet. I can't remember now if we actually met every single week or if we met every other week. It seems unreasonable to think we could actually have met every week to read a play, new plays, and play development. And I'm still at least Facebook friends with all of those people. And I was in New York for 10 years, and I loved it. By the time by the end of that time, I was doing more plays in town. My last play in New York, I worked with the Pearl Theater Company for a while. That's a classical theater company that's now closed down in New York. But my last job in New York was with the Roundabout. It was before they moved uptown. They were still downtown. And I think that had I stayed there, it might have been different. But my boyfriend had moved out to Los Angeles and was loving it. And I went to visit him, and shockingly, I fell in love with Los Angeles too. I didn't think that was possible. I had a Woody Allen view of Los Angeles, and I fell in love with it. It was November. The sky was blue.
The air was smoggy.
Not smoggy at all in November. It's clear and gorgeous. And he was doing some job. So he had a suit, and he gave me his car and what was the Thomas's guide then. We didn't have phones with GPS. So you had these big, thick volumes of the Thomas's guide that would have each page of the streets, and you'd have to map out your trip. But I rolled down the window, and there I was with the radio on and driving around in Los Angeles, and it looked like heaven to me.
Now, I want to back up for a second and actually talk a little bit more about your theatrical time in New York, because when you were telling me that, it kind of started to get me to think about some parallels with something else that might seem a little far-fetched, but bear with me here for a minute. So, I'm a big pro wrestling fan outside of Star Trek and all the other things I'm into. And, when I hear the story about you being this kind of like traveling performer, it kind of reminds me of in that same time period, you had pro wrestlers who were moving from territory to territory on the road all the time. And they're basically carpooling with other veteran, performers, veteran wrestlers, and they're learning from each other. So I'm kind of curious if like you had a similar experience where you're traveling around doing regional theater, but you're hanging out with all these veterans, and maybe like there's one lesson in particular that you remember from someone that kind of stands out to you during that time?
Wow, that's a great question. Uh, I was doing a production in Pennsylvania at the Walnut Street Theater, and I don't know if you'll remember him, but it was an actor, Tony Musarti. Oh, if we Googled him right now, I could tell you it was some cop show that he was on TV for a long, long time. And um, he was so inspiring. He actually had a life. His wife traveled with him, and he gave me the idea that there was something outside of the traveling vagabond, that you could actually have a life, you could have a relationship, you could have nice things with you on the road. They invited me over for dinner and made this incredible meal and everything. And in retrospect, that was a huge gift, because I think up to that point, I was very driven to just having a life or getting the next role or getting the next job. And that was a lesson that life was not about an acting job. Life was about life. You know, what you do when you're not acting doesn't always have to be a temporary gig. You can have a life and still be an actor.
I feel like that's a perfect way to segue into our talk about you going to LA now, because this has now become kind of like your other home, essentially, after you've left New York. And I'd love to know if you can tell me if you remember what your very first professional gig was on screen and what you learned from it.
Ooh, I actually had one gig when I was still in New York. It was on a show called Monsters. And the episode had actually been written by a woman who I knew, who I'd gone to college with. And so she had told the casting person, bring this woman in. So that's how I ended up auditioning and getting that job. And I was on this, it was a funny little show. I was the housewife who is a writer, wants to be a writer, and she has a son, and she makes a pact with the devil he's going to make her a star and get her book published.
Very Faustian kind of story.
Yeah, the devil was played by Chris Noth. Chris Noth was on Sex and the City forever and ever. He was Mr. Big on Sex and the City. But he wasn't Mr. Big at that time. He was Mr. Nobody, as was I. But when we were on the set of that show, Chris was rather impossible. Chris was, on the set, they put these little markings on the floor. They're called your marks. And that's where you're supposed to stand. If you move in a scene, you need to hit that mark so the camera can get you. Well, I was a very good girl, and I always hit my marks. It was important to me to do what I was told. Chris didn't pay any attention to that kind of stuff. Chris would move wherever he had to. They'd have to reshoot it if they missed him, or they'd come up with something else. He would do something different every take. He wouldn't face the way they asked him to face. They'd have to reshoot it. And the crew was pretty frustrated with him. But when we finished that episode and I looked at it later, Chris was fascinating on camera. And I was a little more mechanical. So what Chris taught me, and he even said it to me, hitting my mark is not my job. My job is to be truthful and to be in the moment and be honest, and create a believable human being, or a devil, as the case may be. So that was a really good lesson. It took me a long time to learn that one, but that was where I first heard it. Now, when I went to LA, my first job, it was Hunter. A lot of actors went through Hunter. That would be a fun show to go back and look at some of the episodes. Because
I'm pretty sure I've had someone else on it too, actually.
that was on for a while. And that one, I was very excited about because it was my first job and it was one of my very first auditions that I went to, and I booked it. So that was encouraging for me. It was encouraging for my manager. It was encouraging for my agents. It was just a huge bonus. And so, of course, I went to the set, and the first thing I did, the star of the show, I've lost his name now too, bless his heart. I went up to introduce myself to him, and I held up my hand, and he didn't take it. He just nodded and walked away. And that was very typical, actually. I didn't know that at the time, but it's very typical that when you are a guest star, and that's part of the life of the actor in this town, as a guest star, you're a day player. You might get 2 or 3 days, which is great. But the mood on the set is determined by the star of the show. And so you can get a really good feel for what the show's like by the way the star behaves. And I don't think I've ever walked up to any star on any set again and held my hand out to them. I think I will nod. I will say hello if they speak to me, but I don't speak first. And you'll find as you go through, there are a lot of people who are really fantastic stars on TV, and they are so generous and giving and loving. And so you do meet those. But my first was not. But I did have one scene where when we were shooting it, I forgot my lines. And I was terrified. So I had a few minutes of trying to come up with the line, and I finally found it and said it. But when I watched the episode, when it finally came out, that was the best scene I did, because it was just such a moment of reality of she's thinking of something, what's she going to say? And then she said it. So, just another lesson learned, I guess. But that ended up being a fun shoot for me, just because it was an interesting character. There was another wonderful woman who was the main guest star while I was on that, and she was terrific. And I'm sorry, I don't know her name anymore, but that'd be interesting for me to look her up too, because she was really, really wonderful and kind, and we had some fun times together.
Attention all Starfleet personnel. New York's only fan-run Star Trek convention, Trek Long Island, is back this summer. Get ready for 3 days of sci-fi fun celebrating your favorite franchise in the Empire State. Meet the stars from Trek shows spanning different eras, including Melissa Navia and Yetide Badaki from Strange New Worlds, Gabrielle Ruiz from Lower Decks, Armin Shimmerman, Chase Masterson, J.G. Hertzler, and Kitty Swink from DS9, Ethan Phillips from Voyager, Janet Kidder, Tara Rosling, Conrad Coates, and Elias Tefexis from Discovery, and many more, including celebrities who haven't been at a Star Trek convention in years, like Clyde Kasatsu, Natalia Nogalich, and Daphne Ashbrook. Come meet your fellow fans. Take in a panel with your favorite podcasters. Enjoy Dinner with the Stars, featuring live musical performances. Meet authors, artists, and musicians, and so many more during this epic 3-day event brought to you by the talented and inclusive community that makes Star Trek go at warp speed. Trek Long Island takes place from May 31st to June 2nd at the Hyatt Regency Hotel in Hauppauge, New York. Visit treklongisland.com for tickets, exclusive packages, and more information. Trek Long Island, going kindly this summer.
I feel like we're about to jump into the chronology of your entire career here. So going from Monsters and Hunter, and according to at least IMDb, your third gig has a nice Star Trek connection to it, because that was Quantum Leap. And that was season 2,
yeah.
Goodnight Dearheart. Yeah. When Scott Bakula's character goes into November 1957, your character is Aggie. And you're basically helping him essentially solve more or less an old murder case to some degree, and you're there to help fix up a body. So I'm curious to know if you have any memories of Scott Bakula, because I've heard good things about him. I'm hoping this is a better experience than what you had on Hunter.
He is one of the good guys. Scott Bacula and Din Who was the other
Dean
co-star?
Thomas? Dean Stockwell. Sorry, Dean Stockwell.
Yeah, Dean Stockwell. They were both fantastic. They were generous. They were fun. They, they were they were just the total opposite of the hunter man. And still, I would still run into Scott years later, and he would remember who I was. And we'd have a great conversation. Just truly one of the good guys. My husband ended up working with him on something too, and felt the same way about him. Quantum Leap was great because when I auditioned for that, I took a real chance with the character. They had said it's a New England character, and they had said don't do an audition. But I had lived up in Boston for a long time, so I actually was familiar with the New England accent and Boston accent. And so I decided I was going to try it in the audition. And I did a thing with my hair that made me look a little out there. And the clothes I wore, some pedal pushers. And I just put on some things and did some things with my hair and makeup. And I don't think I wore glasses for it. They put me in glasses when they shot it. But I went out there a little bit as a character. And sometimes when you go into an audition with the casting person, you're just sitting in a chair and you do the audition and you read with the casting person and they tape you to show later. Sometimes when you go out there a little bit with your interpretation, it can be very embarrassing, and they can say, no, do that again, and without the accent, or, speed it up or whatever, or thank you anyway. But I went out there and I got cast. So that was encouraging and exciting, and a reminder that sometimes you can take those risks, you can take those chances, and just go for what you would like to do, your take on it, without worrying so much about what am I supposed to do.
Yeah, I kind of like that you talked about that in that way too, because I watched as many things as I could find with you in it to get ready for this interview, and I watched you in the X-Files, I saw you on Night Court, L.A. Law, like all these different things, and I really actually, as brief as it was, I thought the Quantum Leap character was just so much fun, and you really did something special with her.
Yeah, it was great, and I got a lot of encouragement on the set too, and a lot of love from your audience on an episodic is the crew. And so I got a lot of encouragement from them. And then Scott and Dean, just great guys, really, really great guys.
Now, I've got another role of yours that I checked out. This one does not have a Star Trek connection, but it has a Star Wars connection. And we're going back now for a second here to Touched by an Angel. And your episode, Stealing Hope, features Pedro Pascal long before he was the Mandalorian, long before he was cast as Reed Richards in the Fantastic Four movies coming up soon, long before he was even a known person. Here he is in one of his earliest roles in Hollywood, and You're playing his mother.
Wow. I had not made that connection. That's so wild, because I haven't watched that for a long time. I would recognize him now and remember that, and that would all make sense to me, but I had not realized that. Yeah, that was a wonderful experience, and an odd casting experience, because I didn't audition for that. They just called me up. I think I must have auditioned for the casting person or for somebody, or they had seen me in something else, but they just called me up, and we flew out to Salt Lake City to shoot it. Right? Am I making that up? And
I couldn't tell you that part.
Yeah, I think that's where they shot. And it's when you get cast without an audition, it's only a little frightening because you don't have any idea what they're looking for. You just sort of go in blind and say, well, hopefully it's me. They cast me. But what I remember about that was doing a lot of screaming. The woman is very distressed through a great deal of that. And I guess my theater background kind of helps with that. I can go to those really crazy sort of places. And she was very mentally distressed. And I just adored working with the young people, with the man who played my son, which is so funny that I didn't realize who it was. He was terrific to work with. All of the young people were. And I mean, they all had a good time with each other because they were all young people, but we were all in the same flights together, going and coming. And they let the old gal in a little bit, the mom in, and let me hang with them a little bit. It was a lot of fun to do.
Now, there is one other Star Trek connection, but I want to actually jump into something else here, because I will just throw out for folks who want to know, you were in an episode of Body of Proof with Jerry Ryan, but most of your scene was actually with Mark Valley. But I did want to actually go into something that kind of surprised me, because I knew you from something else totally unrelated to the stuff I normally watch here, and it was unexpected. I was a fan of Spectacular Spider-Man. I was a fan of that cartoon, and when I realized that was your voice as Aunt May, like, yeah. What? Oh my goodness. And yeah, and then I found out later on you were in Young Justice as Granny Goodness for a bunch of episodes. Yeah. And I'm like, are you kidding me? That's you.
Yeah. For a couple of years as Granny Goodness. Yeah. Actually. Yeah. Couple of seasons. Those were so much fun to do. If I could do voiceover on animation the rest of my life, I would be a happy woman. Those were so much fun to do. And that actually came about through my theater.
Really?
Yeah, the theater I do now. The writer and producer on the show, on those two shows, was a patron at the theater where I perform all the time. And his wife,
that's A Noise Within, correct?
Yeah, at A Noise Within. His wife said to him, "Greg, you should have Deborah come in and audition for Aunt May." And he said, "Oh, yeah." So he did. And consequently, I got cast. And that was strictly through my theater link. But yeah, that was both of those were really, really fantastic things to do.
Again, most of your career up to this point has been on stage or you're in front of a camera. This time now, like you said, it's behind the scenes. You're just doing something in a sound stage, probably alone other than like engineers. You're not really interacting with anybody, but you said you loved the experience. So I'm curious to know, what was it that made this so interesting for you? Because again, it's so different than everything else that you're used to doing.
It's very different. And it's always a little frightening to do something new and different. But what's great about the way they worked on Spider-Man and on Young Justice is that they frequently would bring a lot of the actors in at the same time. And we would all be in there. There could be like 6 of us on different mics and doing it, like doing a play, like doing a story, only with voices. And they have some great talent on those shows. They tend to work with a lot of the same people. So a lot of the people who worked on Spider-Man also worked on Young Justice, and they have a real repertory company with it almost. The director, whose name, I should have looked up everything I've ever done, was so fantastic. Greg Weissman, who developed and did the writing and is a good friend of mine now. Such a talented man and a big Shakespeare lover too. And so it was more of a repertory feel around the mics. Now, there were times when they would just have me come in along because they sort of work around your schedule when you do the voiceover work. And at that time, it was still, you get a lot of feedback because the director is reading with you. He's giving feedback. You can retake things. You can play. You can experiment. And the technicians for voiceover are amazing. So they can take whatever you've done and compress it, expand it, do various things with it. The sound people are a pretty talented bunch.
I mean, well, I gotta say, it's just fun meeting Granny Goodness, and you're in good company here. I don't know if you're aware of like the history of that character as far as in cartoons, but like I think the first person was Ed Asner to take that role.
Yes, that's true. Yeah. I started learning more about her once I got into her. At first, I Googled Granny Goodness, and I couldn't find a lot on her. But then when I Googled her alter ego, then I came up with the whole background and everything of who she was. But yeah, that
kind of helped you find your voice for her.
Yeah.
Hey everybody, we'll get right back to the interview in 1 second, but I wanted to remind you all to check out Trek Untold over at Patreon. Patreon is the best way to directly support creators of things you like through a monthly subscription of an amount that you can choose. Trek Untold has a few different tiers already with different benefits, ranging from early access to episodes, the ability to ask a future guest questions, exclusive merchandise, and other bonuses that I'd love to offer, but first I need to grow that Patreon community to do that. Trek Untold has been around since mid-2020 and has grown a ton since then, thanks to listeners and viewers like you. Through a platform like Patreon, you can help me keep improving the quality of each episode and keep bringing you new interviews with folks that make the Star Trek universe what it is. If this community can grow more over on Patreon, I can offer new perks like watch parties, exclusive Trek Untold episodes, being able to directly interact with guests, and other things, but in order to do that, I need to know my audience wants these things. The best way to tell me what you want is by supporting us on Patreon, so please check us out at patreon.com/TrekUntold today and become a bigger part of the Trek Untold family. And now, back to the interview. So Deborah, let's beam into our Star Trek discussion right now. And you were Admiral T'Lara in Deep Space Nine's Rules of Engagement. I gotta tell you, just before we even get into things here, I'm always hesitant about court dramas in Star Trek. They can be sometimes a little stinky or they can be amazing. And I think this episode is one of my favorite DS9s ever. I love this one, actually, and it's a treat to watch this one. So I'm curious to find out if you had auditioned for Star Trek before you landed this role in DS9.
I knowing I was going to be doing this with you, Matthew, I tried to rack my brain about that. I have zero memory of auditioning for that show and for that episode. I don't know why, but that's the case. Now, Junie Lowry, I think, is the casting director on there.
Junie Lowry Johnson.
Yeah, I would have certainly been in to see her for lots of things because she was a really big deal. And certainly everybody I know had been on Star Trek. And I can't imagine that I wouldn't have been in for other characters. But auditioning for that particular role, I have no memory. But I knew when I was going in who I was going to be working with. And one of the great things about Deep Space Nine is it used classical actors from Los Angeles all the time. So everybody I knew had been on the show. I don't know why I hadn't been on it before, just not the right role, I guess. And a lot of the actors, the regulars, Avery Brooks, of course, I knew him from New York, not personally, but I knew his work from New York stage. Armin Shimmerman, who I know very well now because he works at a classical theater here in Los Angeles.
The Antaeus Theater.
Yeah. John Billingsley, who's been on forever, I've known for a long, long time. So it's kind of like it was a family show then with people I didn't really know, and now it's fun to watch old episodes because you see everybody you've ever known in there. But why I don't remember auditioning for it, I'm not sure. If I plowed through some old boxes, I might find some notes or memos or. Well, we didn't have iPhones or anything or emails that were recorded then. It was all phone calls. So it could be that Junie had seen me in something and just called me in as a last minute replacement. And that's why I just showed up on set for makeup and had no background of why I was in there.
Well, maybe this will help refresh your memory here because, we alluded to your husband a little bit earlier, but your husband had done Star Trek a few years before you had done Star Trek here. So I'm curious if you remember, when you got that gig, when you booked that role, did you go up to your husband and say, hey, what should I do? I'm in Star Trek.
Yes, I did. And he actually, and I knew I was going to be a Vulcan. So I looked at I didn't look at old episodes. I tried to tune in to current episodes and take a look at Spock to see what he had done as a Vulcan and get a sense of that. And the big hint that Joel gave me was something he had been told by Armin Shimmerman, and that's the time in the makeup chair is a long, long time to prepare for that. So just relaxation and calm and breathing through straws and and relaxing into the makeup experience on that show. I also had directed at A Noise Within in our summer program for teenagers, Summer with Shakespeare, a young girl who was the daughter of the makeup artist.
Of Michael Westmore?
Yes. So I was very familiar with the Westmore family and their process. So that was a link for me as well. I let him know I was going to be on the show, and I talked to him about it beforehand. So it must not have been a last-minute call if I'd had time to do a little bit of research and talk to Michael and all.
Well, the upside about being a Vulcan, though, is that you're not going to be sitting in the makeup chair for necessarily 4 hours a day, right? You're going to basically just be getting in the ears. So, do you remember what it was like to get the ear casting process and getting into that kind of character?
It was still a long time. I don't know why, but it was still a long time. I was probably in there for 2, maybe 3 hours.
Really?
Yeah. So you can imagine for those I mean, it's easier now because they do these casts that give you a latex thing that you fit over your head. So it's a much easier process now. But when my husband was on the show, he was in the makeup chair for 5-6 hours. But I remember getting a call to be there at probably 5 or 6 a.m. to start the process.
Were you wearing a wig as well, along with the Starfleet uniform? Was a wig too? Okay, yeah. So I mean, again, like you're not really looking at your career. You haven't really done a lot of at that point prosthetic heavy gigs. You might have done some on stage, perhaps, but this is Star Trek. This is kind of like a whole different world here. So, how did that affect your performance to be wearing these little pointy ears, to have this wig on you, and now you're wearing this potentially constricting Starfleet uniform?
Mm-hmm.
Did that help you, hinder you? What was that like for you, if you can recall?
Costumes and wigs always help an actor. Always. They tell you who your character is. And the restriction for a Vulcan is also helpful because, you can't be big and huge. You have to be very logical and contained and focused once you're in all of that gear. So I would say it was all very helpful. And it was helpful, too, that I only remember it being one day. I don't know if that's possible to have shot all of that courtroom stuff in one day. It might have been more days, but I only remember one really, really, really long day. And they drew all of the other people first. So they didn't really have the camera on me except when it might swing around. So I was there all day getting to watch everybody else and respond to everybody else all day long, which was also helpful because you get to be there and relax and be there with everybody without the pressure of the camera being on you right away.
That's kind of the interesting thing about Admiral T'Lara is basically you walk into the scene, you ring a bell, and then you sit down, and that's you for the next 45 minutes.
Yeah.
But you do get to watch everybody performing, which, let's talk about that, because you've got in front of you for the entire episode, Michael Dorn, Avery Brooks, and then guest starring Ron Canada, who we've had on this podcast, and he was one of my favorite interviews I've done on this show. If anybody hasn't listened to that one, go back in time and check it out. But I'm curious if you can tell us anything, or if you remember anything about just witnessing the work of Avery, of Michael, and of Ron Canada, and just all these guys gelling together, because they really, I felt like, made something special in that episode.
Yeah, they were pretty astounding. And the director was LeVar Burton.
Yep, it's one of LeVar's, if not first, one of his first.
Yeah, and he was amazing too. I remember it being a challenging shoot because there were a lot of technical things that happened during the day, whether it was lighting or camera movement or catching things, a lot of discussions. I feel like LeVar had, one idea how it was going to be shot, and somebody else had a different idea. Anyway, I remember it taking a lot of time. Always does. It always does. But this seemed to be a lot of stress and strain on everybody. Mm-hmm. But as I said, I got to just sit there and witness most of it. And it was like attending a master class. Avery Brooks is just astounding. Ron Canada, who I didn't know at that time, Michael Dorn, Armin Shimmerman came in to do his bid. And he was so kind to me. He didn't know me personally, but he had worked with my husband. So we had that link, and he was so generous and kind and full of advice. I told them that his makeup advice had been what had changed my husband around in the makeup chair when he had done the show. It was like a masterclass watching those men work and watching their presence. And I remember feeling just a little bit, although the wig and the ears and everything added to the Vulcan character, I remember feeling a little envious that they were able to really emote and be reactive. And T'Lara could not do those things. She had to be contained. But, that was the character.
And I said this to Ron in our interview, and I'm going to say it to you as well. I feel like whenever I'm seeing Ron on screen and the way he's composed in the shots, I'm always just like really drawn to the way the character looks. And watching this episode again, now with a broader eye and having talked to Ron as well, I'm like looking at the way that Avery is shot in every scene, and Michael is shot in every scene, and the way that T'Lara is shot in every scene, the way you're shot in every scene. Something about it really is very magnetic. It's very different from other episodes, and it really feels like something, maybe it's LeVar's eye. I don't know what it is, but everybody just feels like their weight is so much heavier as far as on screen than it does in a normal Star Trek episode. And going back to working with LeVar, I don't know if you felt any of that with him, but I guess bigger question here is, have you rewatched the episode since it aired, and what do you think about the way it looked and how it came out?
I rewatched it for this because I couldn't remember a thing about it. I didn't watch a lot of the Deep Space Nines, so I can't compare it the way you just did to the other episodes. But I do feel like, from what I know, this one was so character-driven with those men and the intensity of that courtroom scene, all contained in that little space. So, and a long, long shooting day. It was pretty intense with a lot of personality in that room. But I loved it. I had a great position to sit and watch it all, and it was wonderful. Everybody was generous and respectful, but it was intense emotionally, and I think LeVar did have a lot to do with that. I think he was really encouraging everybody to give it, some high stakes.
It's always fun doing this show and like talking to folks who got to play different aliens, because you talk to them and you're like, you know what, I can actually really see you as that. I mean, like even right now, your choice of earrings today, it's very Vulcan-like. I don't know if you were aware of that, but it's very much a Vulcan kind of decor, which works really well for you. Yeah. But on that note, I'm just kind of curious to know, talking about being a Vulcan, did you, Deborah, get to take home the ears?
No. No, I didn't get to take home the ears. I didn't get to take home the ears. What a great question. I don't know if it occurred to me to ask for them. I remember it took almost as long to get out of all of that makeup as to put it on. Isn't that weird? It didn't seem like I had on that much, but, it took a while. The hardest thing, and the thing I do remember very clearly about shooting that, was it had been a long, intense day. And it was at the end of the day. I mean, I think I'd been called at like 5 a.m. and it was probably close to 10 p.m. when they finally turned the cameras around on me. And then I got to do all of my scenes with the camera on me. And I got to the last little bit, and I can't remember, when I rewatched it, I couldn't remember which set of lines it was they were shooting. I couldn't say the lines. I kept losing the lines, and they had to shoot it over and over and over again. They called the last shoot of the day the martini shot, meaning that once you finish it, you can go have your martini and go home. And so the crew was all ready to go home. I was exhausted. They were all exhausted. And here was the guest star, unable to say her lines. I know now it happens all the time with everybody, and it's not a big deal. But for me, being the good girl and the experienced actor and the professional, it was very frustrating and embarrassing to not be able to say my lines for that final shot. I mean, we obviously finally got it, but I remember it being one of my worst experiences on film at not being able to deliver when the time was mine, because I'd been delivering all day long for everybody else. And when it came time for me, I just couldn't get my mouth, my lips, my tongue around it.
I mean, it's understandable after doing a day that long with all that makeup on you. It can probably be a little frazzling, but I do have to poke the bear, and I have to ask Deborah, do you remember what that line was?
I tried to remember when I was looking at it again the other night. I couldn't tell you, because none of them seemed to be challenging lines. It wasn't any big deal. Maybe they cut it. Maybe they cut the line. Maybe they cut that section. It wasn't needed. It was something that was a little bit longer and technical and had some particular techie words in it or Trekkie words in it that I stumbled on. And, maybe if I watched it again, I would remember now. But that was pretty painful. And, it's so interesting to bring up some of the things I've done, because I haven't gone back to watch all of them. The way you get your, whenever you do a show, you usually call up some organization and they get you a tape of it or a demo of it, so that you have all that. But they're all in different things that no longer play anymore. The kinds of media that it was taped on, I can't play them anymore. So I suppose I could Netflix everything or Prime everything and find it all and watch it or rent it. But I haven't done that. But it is hard to go back and look at things. I love being on stage. You don't get to see your work. You just get to do it. But on film, it's there and it's there forever. And so I find myself being a little judgmental of my work and thinking, oh, why did I do that? Why didn't I do this?
Well, I had a lot of fun just digging through your stuff. And yeah, I did have to jump around from like Netflix to Peacock to Paramount to YouTube for a bunch of things. So I know what you mean. But the upside is, if anybody wants to really look up Deborah's career, as far as on video, it is out there.
Oh, wow. That's good to know. That's good to know.
But that's the video side of things, though. But I am curious now to dig in a little bit deeper to your theater stuff, because really, I think most of your career probably, it's safe to say, has been theatrical, correct? And
yes.
The way I found out about you was, in fact, through the theater we mentioned earlier, which is the theater in Pasadena, I believe, right? And that's the Noise Within. So
yes.
I think you've been with them since like 1997, right?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. Earlier than that, probably 93, 92.
Really? And you've been burnt with that place. I mean, today you are a resident artist at A Noise Within. Yes. So tell us a little bit about what makes A Noise Within so special and what's kept you in this same theater for as long as you've been there.
A Noise Within is a classical repertory theater. That means that, well, we don't do this anymore since the pandemic, but what they used to do was 6 shows a year. They'd do 3 that would rotate in the fall and 3 that would rotate in the spring. So you could, as a resident artist, they had a set company of actors who were the resident artists. They had a lot of guest artists as well, people that come in for 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 shows. And it's based on the classics. We do Shakespeare, we do Shaw, we do Chekhov, and we also do American classics like
Our
all
Town.
my, all my son's Glass Menagerie, things like that. And we do modern classics. A classic is anything that we think will still be relevant in 100 years. So right now we're doing a series of August Wilson plays. He did a whole 10 series based in Pittsburgh, and we're doing one of those every year. And we do pretty new plays as well. We did a new adaptation of The Bluest Eye, a Toni Morrison book that we did this past year, which was a new adaptation of that novel, which was wonderful. So it's a lot of the classical actors who all would have been on Star Trek during its run, too. It's something we all had in common. But when I stumbled through that door, primarily it was through my husband. He knew some of the people. He had gone to school up in San Francisco at American Conservatory Theater. And the founders of A Noise Within also went to school there. So Joel, my husband, found it first. The first year of the company, I just made brownies for the concessions. But the next year, I got involved with the theater. And it's really the life that an actor is always looking for. A repertory theater is what Shakespeare's troupe did and what Moliere's troupe did. They had a set company of actors who worked together over multiple plays. And you really get to a point of trust with everybody. It's not like being a guest star coming into a show for one day. You're part of the regulars on the show. So people are familiar with you. They know your work. You can take greater risks in rehearsal to try new things because you don't have to be afraid that you're going to get fired or you're going to get reprimanded for it. You can trust that the work will be there. So I just stumbled through that door behind my husband, and it's created that life that I wanted all along, was to be able to have a life, a family of actors that I worked with. I could have a home that I could come home to. And it gave me that deeper, more fulfilling life that augmented my career as an actor.
When we talk about careers in the arts, instability is often the first thing that comes to people's mind. Like I deal with it for what I'm doing, but it's kind of interesting to know that, we're basically now having our interview with you go full circle here, Deborah, because, we go back to the start of this chat and I talked about your time with Mr. Big and how he was telling you, there's possible, or rather even before that, your time when you're on the road and there is a life and it's possible and you're doing it now. You've lived that dream.
Yeah, I really have. It was not what I always aimed for or expected to find, but somehow or another, I did find it. And it's what I've done a lot of teaching as well at A Noise, but then we had a conservatory and I taught adult acting Shakespeare classes. And what I always told to my students and to the young people who come to the play and ask, what should I do if I want to be an actor? What should I do to get there? And what I always tell them is make sure you have a life. Make sure you fall in love. Make sure you read books. Make sure you travel whenever you can. Make sure you pay attention in history. Because as an actor, being aware of historical significance for the things that you end up being in is important. To get your heart broken, go to ball games, play a sport, keep healthy. Those are the things you do to become an actor.
All right. So, Deborah, that kind of wraps up what we're able to talk about today, but there's so much more that we didn't get into. So I kind of want to see if we can encapsulate some of that in our lightning round here at the end of this chat today. So this is, I call it the lightning round, but it's really not. It's probably the hardest questions in this interview. So we'll see how it goes. So, Deborah, best day on the job you ever had and worst day on the job. And that could be on stage or on screen.
Oh, well, the worst day was on my episode of Deep Space Nine when I could not remember my lines at the end of the day. Oh, terrible. My best day is definitely going to be on stage and live. And so there's been so many great days on stage. Um, Probably the one that comes to mind is I was doing a play, a one-person play called An Iliad, where I told the entire story of the Iliad on stage. And at the end of it, just finishing the story and realizing I had done it, that I had told an hour and a half story to a live audience.
Yeah, that's the one thing I got to say about stage actors is like, I don't know how you guys do it. Like, it's one thing to have, do a TV show and have a script, some person in front of you telling you how to say something, you forget it, but you're on stage and you're remembering like such dense dialogue. And then you're doing repertory. So you're doing different shows at the same time. I know you have students, they probably are struggling with the same thing, but like, how the heck do you actually do that? That's like a feat.
It's really, really hard. I was just saying this to my sister earlier today. It's really challenging to memorize lines. And the older I get, the more challenging it is. But I'm a whole lot better at it now than I was when I was younger, when, they would just go right in the brain. But it's like memorizing a song. You probably know the lyrics to a whole lot of songs, and you never even tried to memorize them. You just heard the song over and over and over, and you know the lyrics now. What's the same thing? When I work on lines, I work on them out loud so that I'm hearing the song, and I try to do things. Maybe I'll get up and run my lines walking around the room or on an exercise bike or walking around the neighborhood or just jumping up and down or just so that changes the melody of the song a little bit and makes you a little more flexible. But I'm doing a play. I start rehearsals in April on a Shaw play, Miss Alliance, and I am starting the work on the lines now, just so by the time the rehearsals began, I pretty much got them in there somewhere. But it is challenging. We make fun about how that's the easiest part of it, but it's not. It's really hard. It helps if you know what it is you're saying, why you're saying it, and who you're saying it to. So that, then it makes sense that what you're saying is the logical thing.
All right. Well, how about this question now for you, Deborah? What is, if you were to tell somebody the one role to watch that you are the most proud of, the one that you think is Deborah at her best, what would you tell someone to watch?
And this would be on camera, right?
Well, it's actually, since you are a theater person as well, let's make it, let's just pretend that there was a camera in the theaters too. What was that one role that you were the most proud of that you tell people about all the time and say, this is me?
Well, it might be an Iliad, but you know what? Probably on camera, the one that I would be most proud of would probably be X-Files. It was a great part. It was a very interesting, multifaceted part. And you would get to see very much like this is well, not Deborah, but two of the sides of Deborah.
All right, well, how about something you know today that you wish you knew when you were younger?
Something that I know today and I wish I knew when I was younger, that it's okay not to know your lines. It's okay to mess up sometimes, because that's where the really great things get discovered. And that being an actor requires a lot of work. It's not just play. It's really work.
Yeah, I feel like based on that reaction, there's a story potentially about that. Was there a moment where that happened to you where you maybe just had a sort of stumble like that on stage and something else happened that made some kind of magic?
Not so much on stage, but just in life in general. I think that sometimes as actors, we go through life trying to do whatever we think is right. You go to an audition, it's like, oh, what do they want? I have to be this for them. And if you can sometimes just let go of what is expected of you, like Chris Noth did on Monsters, just let go of what everybody else's needs are, and just let something bubble up and be there and happen, or create something that can surprise somebody, or take a risk. Just take a risk at trying something, even if it's wrong or bad. If it's a film, they can reshoot it. They can redo the take. You know, if it's on stage, well, for stage, you get a lot of rehearsal. So you can work all that out in rehearsal so that on stage, it doesn't happen so much. But it's okay. It's okay to let yourself risk being bad to achieve something really great.
That's a great way to put it. And I think we've talked about that point a lot in this podcast, how in any kind of artistic career, you have to make the mistakes to move forward. It's just, unfortunately, in an artistic kind of career, it tends to be in a very public sort of way. But it really does feel like
humiliation, yeah.
Yes, sadly. But it really does kind of feel like that is the essence of what you were talking about earlier in finding the truth. And the truth is going to be the truth of the character, but also staying true to yourself.
Yeah.
And so how about this one now, Deborah? And I feel like we might have actually answered this at the start of our interview, but what was the most valuable lesson that somebody taught you about life or your profession that you still think about today?
That having a life outside your career is vital. You can't just be acting all the time.
And last thing for you today, Deborah, what's the best thing about being a part of the Star Trek universe?
It's a huge family, and you're going to meet somebody you know every step of the way. Every time you watch that show, you're going to see somebody you know.
Well, Deborah, thank you so much for telling us all your great stories about on stage, on screen, everything else in between. And I want to also throw a quick shout out to A Noise Within. So visit anoisewithin.org if you want to learn what Deborah's doing and what everybody else is doing at the theater. Go check out his show, check out what's going on in the repertory. Deborah, again, thank you so much. It's been awesome. It's cool talking to a Vulcan, but it's honestly for me more exciting to talk to Aunt May and Granny Goodness. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Matthew. This was great.
That's it for this week's episode of Trek Untold. Thank you for checking it out. Don't forget to follow us on social media, whether it's on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or TikTok at Trek Untold, and subscribe wherever you are listening to or watching on. And that includes the audio versions on whatever platforms that might be, and our YouTube channel, youtube.com/@TrekUntold. If you'd like to support this show financially, please consider visiting patreon.com/TrekUntold to become a member of this show. And along with getting access to all sorts of wonderful perks, you'll also know that you're helping out this show continue to thrive, survive, and make new content all the time. I'm Matthew Kaplowitz. This has been Trek Untold. Thanks for watching. And until next time, always remember, fortune favors the bold.
Trek Untold, the Star Trek podcast that goes beyond the stars, is powered by the Rageworks Podcast Network and affiliated with Nerd News Today.